Good morning, FCCT. How are you guys doing today? Good, good. Was it hot enough for you this week? Yeah? All right. Everybody satisfied? You feel like you got your full range of, helping you to understand why you don't want to go to hell? You all got, you all received the warning? You got it? Good. It's all clear? Okay, good. We're going to talk today about serving because we're in the midst of a sermon series on serving. As Isaiah said, "Here am I, Lord, send me." We want to be of service in God's kingdom. And we've been talking about some of the fundamentals and kind of the prerequisites of service. We've been talking about kind of the heart of service and the different virtues that are required to serve correctly. And today we're going to go into starting the last three sermons of our sermon series are going to be very practical. And today we're going to be talking about serving in the family. We're also going to talk about serving in the church and serving in the world in upcoming sermons. But we're going to be in Proverbs chapter 22, verse 6 today. And it's a very well-known proverb. It's one that you've heard before. And we want to look at it as a model of how to serve in the family. And so Proverbs chapter 22, verse 6 says, "Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it." Now, how many of you guys are familiar with that proverb? Okay, pretty much everybody here, right? You've heard it. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he gets old, he will not depart from it. Now, the thing that it's important to remember about Proverbs is that Proverbs are statements of general truth. Generally speaking, this is kind of how it works. And if you are alive, and I think most of us are here, you understand this proverb probably far better than you think. How many of you guys have ever decided that the way that your family functioned, maybe you grew up and maybe your family was great, but it had a few problems, or maybe your family was a disaster, I don't know. How many of you guys decided when you were younger that you were going to change those things and you were not going to repeat any of those things? How many of you guys remember saying to yourself, "I want to change things"? How many of you guys have found that it was harder than you thought to change those things? Right? Why is that? Because this proverb of general truth is generally true. Right? When you train up a child, generally speaking, that is the way that our lives will unfold. And if we want to change things, it requires a tremendous amount of effort to really make that happen in our lives. And what we're going to look at today is that when we are if we just dedicate ourselves to God's service, then we're going to want to serve God in our families. And in order to do that, we have to understand this idea of training, because service in the family is all about training. Right? So we're going to look at three things today. We're going to look at training ourselves, we're going to look at training others, and then we're going to talk about celebrating victory. And so we're going to start here by talking about training ourselves, because here's the thing that's important to understand, is that if you're in the family, then you're going to have to train yourself first. And we're going to talk about why that is in a second here, but this is important, is that everybody who is going to be training is going to be first being trained. Right? There's no like, I'm just going to start at the top here, right? That's not how it works. You start at the bottom, you start by being trained. In Proverbs chapter 1, verse 8 and 9, it says, "Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching, for they are a graceful garland for your head and pendants for your neck." Now, it's interesting that this is at the very beginning of the book of Proverbs, right? This is just 7 verses into the book of Proverbs. We have this description of what the book of Proverbs is going to be. In fact, the book of Proverbs is actually set out and designed as basically a king teaching his son. And he's teaching his son wisdom. Right? And the thing that's interesting about that is that it lays out two things. It lays out kind of what the book of Proverbs is for, how it should be used, but it also lays out what the family function really is. The family functions as a way of training up the younger generation. That's what it does, right? That's its function. Now, it's a place of love, it's a place of respect, it's a place of a lot of things, but primarily it functions as a place of training. And it's important for us to understand that, because a lot of times what happens in our culture is it's sold as something else. Right? Our culture sells the family and childhood as a place of making your child's childhood magical. You know what I'm saying? It basically teaches us to indulge every whim of our child so that they can look back and see that they had a magical childhood. Well, the thing is that I'm not saying that that's all wrong, because obviously we want our children to be joyful. We want them to experience joy in our family, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the third point of our sermon. We talk about celebrating victories. But the thing that we have to understand is primarily the function of the family is a place of training. Now, why is that the case? Well, it's because basically information doesn't do what we think it does. Information doesn't do what we think it does. This is important. We need to understand the need for training. Now, when I was younger, I thought that information solved all the problems of my life, right? And now that we have the internet, I think a lot of people think that information solves the problems of your life. You know, it's amazing to have a device in your pocket that you can look up literally anything you want to know. And now we have AI, which is great, because AI will basically go out there and read everything that's out there, that's available, and then it will summarize that for you in a few points, right? And so it's this amazing tool. The problem is, have you noticed that since AI has been available, that the world has just turned into utopia? Have you noticed that that's the case? That everything, all of our problems are solved, everybody's perfect, people are nice to each other, they're kind to each other, everything works, the trains run on time, right? The flights are never canceled. Everything works just beautifully now because AI is here to tell us all the information that we need to know. Is that the way it's worked out? No, it hasn't, right? And hopefully we're not under the impression that that's the way it's going to work out. The reason is because information is not all that's required. And I remember having this kind of brought home to me in my first youth ministry. So as a new youth minister, I wanted the kids to want to come, and I wanted them to learn something, and I was, very idealistic, very excited. And there was this kid in my youth group. He was a little bit of a trouble maker. He was kind of a handful, and I remember thinking, I want to change this kid's life. I really want him to get a hold of what God wants for him, and I really wanted to be that transformative person in his life. And I was in Missouri at the time, and I remember that in Missouri there was a Sunday night service, and so the adults had something going on, and I was teaching the kids. And I remember that his mom would drop him off. They lived outside of town. It was about a 25-minute drive. So she would drive for 25 minutes to drop him off. And then she would turn around and she would drive home, spending 25 minutes driving home. And then she would basically be at home for about 25 minutes. And then she would turn around and drive back for 25 minutes to pick him up. And then she would drive home for 25 minutes. So she spent about 50 minutes on the road extra to avoid going to the adult service. And I remember a few months into my stint there as a youth minister, I remember her coming to me and saying, hey, I don't know if you can do anything different, maybe make things more exciting or whatever, because, he's telling me he doesn't want to go, and I just don't understand why that is. And what the interesting thing was, I was actually having success with pretty much all the other kids. And it struck me that what he was experiencing was something that is important to understand as far as the family and the way it functions. His mother was telling him it was important for him to go to church, while demonstrating it was completely unimportant for her to go to church. In fact, she would spend 50 minutes on the road to avoid going to church. So here's the thing. What she was saying was one thing, but what she was training him in was something else. Now, how many of us have experienced this in our lives? Right? We know something to be the case, right? How many of us know we should exercise more? Since I made that realization, I have gotten into perfect shape. You can see it, can't you? I mean, it's impressive. I have to admit, I look at myself in the mirror and think, woohoo, looking good. I mean, ever since I knew that I needed to exercise more, it's just like the weight just melted off and I just got fit. No, see, the realization that we have to make is that the knowledge of something is one thing. And how many of you have experienced that you know some things you should be doing in your life, but you're struggling with doing them? Right? Do we have that? We do, don't we? Why is that? Because the thing is, we've trained ourselves to do one thing, while in our minds we know we have the information of something else, right? I know I should be doing this, but I struggle to do it. In fact, I find myself not being able to do it. I want to do this thing so badly, but I can't. Why? Because I've trained myself to do something else. Right? So the problem that we have here is that if we're going to be in the family and if you're a parent, if you're going to be training the next generation coming up, the thing that you have to understand is that if you're not trained first, you will have no hope of training the next generation. Because the thing is, you'll be able to tell the next generation what they should do, but at the same time, you're going to be training them to do the opposite. Right? Because the thing is that you have trained yourself in this, and you're telling them that, but they're going to follow the training that they're receiving. They're not going to follow the words that they're hearing. They're going to follow the training that they're receiving. If you tell your kids a truth, but you train them in falsehood, they will go up to live in falsehood. And the gap between truth and training is your own lack of training. You know the truth, but you haven't trained yourself in it. I find that a lot of times when people come to church, they're looking for inspiration rather than truth and training. You see, a lot of times when people come to church, they're not actually looking for truth to train themselves in, they're looking for inspiration. And because they're under the impression that if they can gain enough inspiration, that they can overcome the training that they've given themselves. You see, a lot of times people train themselves to live in an ungodly way. But then they come to church, and what they do is they hope that they hear something so inspiring that they can go out and that from that moment on, they will live completely differently. And failing that, because let's face it, I'm not Billy Graham, failing that, they hope that they can at least hear something inspiring enough that they can get through the next week. But that's not the way that it works. That isn't the way that it works. The reason for this conundrum that they find themselves in is because they want to continue to live being ruled by their emotions. They have a bad outcome from the way that they're living. And so they focus on having different emotions. It never occurs to them that maybe the secret is not to follow their emotions at all. You see, if I have the emotions to live one way and I live that way and I have a bad outcome, I can say, well, I want to live a different way. And you think that because I've lived this way according to my emotions, if my emotions just change, I will live in this other way. And so we spend all this time in our lives searching for that thing that will change our emotions, searching for that bit of truth that will make everything different. We're searching for that one piece of information that will change the way I feel about everything. And from that moment on, I will live a different life. And I will tell you that that is not the way that it works. You should rather work on being ruled by God and His Word rather than your emotions. Rather than looking for something that will change your emotions, look for how you can be obedient to God in His Word. In 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7 and 8, it says, "Have nothing to do with irreverent, silly myths. Rather, train yourself for godliness." You see, even back in the day of Paul, what they understood was that there's all kinds of people who will sell you snake oil. Just know this truth and everything in your life will change. Just know this thing and everything will change. Just do this one thing. Do this one funny trick and everything will be different in your life. But Paul is saying, don't do that. It's an irreverent, silly myth. What is going to transform your life? Train yourself for godliness. And he continues on in verse 8. It says, "For while bodily training is of some value, godliness is of value in every way as it holds promise for the present life and also for the life to come. Just like learning that you should be exercising or even being inspired to exercise one time is not going to change your life, but rather disciplining yourself, training yourself to exercise will change your life physically. In the same way, if you want to change your life spiritually, you have to discipline yourself to follow God's word. And you have to do it all the time, even when you don't feel like it. If you leave from here and you say, well, I'm going to do this thing because I'm inspired to do it, and you give up after you do it one time, it will not change your life at all. You have to go home and say, what does God's truth say to me? How does He want me to live? And then every time you have to say to yourself, I will live this way despite my feelings. I will live in God's truth and I will obey God's truth rather than obeying my feelings. I will make my feelings the caboose of my life rather than the locomotive. God's word and God's will be the locomotive, and eventually my emotions will follow with it. This requires discipline until the emotions flow, until they have become so connected to the train that is led by God's word that they become something that will reliably be in line with God's word. And here's why it's so important that you become a trainee first. Because the truth is that it requires more discipline and training to train others than it does to even train yourself. And if you haven't been able to train yourself, you won't be able to train others. This is just the way that it works. You know this, if you're a parent and you have tried to teach your kids to brush their teeth on a regular basis, you know that this is true. If you have tried to teach your kids to bathe regularly, to do their laundry, to wash whatever it is, if you have tried to train your kids to do anything, you know that it is so much harder to train them to do this than it is to do it yourself. Haven't you figured? How many of you guys have figured that out? Right? It's so much easier. I remember when we were training our kids when they were young to brush their teeth. They would come out, they'd say it's bedtime, and we'd say, oh, go brush your teeth. And so then they would come out a few minutes later after, goofing around, wrestling, breaking things, stuff like that. After an appropriate amount of that time, they would come out and say, okay, we're ready for bed. And we would say, did you brush your teeth? And they'd say, yes, we did. And so we'd get up and we'd walk over and we would feel their toothbrush, as dry as a bone. And we were like gods to them. It was like, Columbo. It was like Sherlock Holmes. We were like, how did you figure this out? And so we would go, hey, you didn't do this. You need to do this. And then they got smart. They would wet their toothbrush and put it back. Right? And so we would feel the toothbrush and they thought they were in the clear, and we'd say, come over here. Let me smell your breath. No, you did not brush your teeth. Right? Here's the thing, is that it was actually way harder to get them to learn. It's easy to brush your own teeth. It's really hard to keep on them and keep on them and keep on them and keep on, right? It's hard to discipline them. That's why you have to have discipline yourself, because if you're going to pass that on, if you're going to discipline the next generation, if you're going to train them up in the way that they should go, it's going to require more of you than you could possibly know. Your discipline and your training must overcome their lack. In Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 8 and 9, we read this last week. It says, and the officers shall speak further to the people and say, is there any man who is fearful and faint-hearted? These were the rules for war, right? So if Israel's going to go out to war, this is what they had to say. So they had this list of things that could get you out of going to war. And the last one was this, is there any man who is fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go back to his house. Why? Lest he make the heart of his fellows melt like his own. You see, it's one thing to have the discipline to overcome your own fear, but it's another thing to have enough discipline to overcome your own fear and the fear of the person next to you. That's a lot more. Do you remember David as king? Do you remember that David was a shepherd and he had fought lions and bears? And do you remember that he was taking some lunch to his brothers who were at the front fighting the Philistines. Remember that? And do you remember that he heard Goliath come out and challenge the Israelites? And all the Israelites were fearful of Goliath, and nobody would go out to meet him. What was it about David that God saw in his heart when he chose him to be king? Well, David is demonstrating it there at the front. Because while everybody else is afraid of Goliath, he says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that comes to defy the armies of the living God? You see, David had enough discipline, he had enough training in his heart that not only could he overcome his own fear, but he could overcome the fear of the entire army. He could stand up in front of a group of hardened, tough, strong, dangerous men who were quaking with fear. He could walk through that fear and say, I have enough discipline of heart to stand up to this guy, even when everybody around me is fearful. That's the kind of person that can train a nation. But to train a family, you have to have enough discipline and enough training for your own heart and for the hearts of the people around you. There's a great danger in indulging yourself. We feel like we can indulge ourselves. We can indulge our emotions. We can put off the training. And then when the time of need comes, we'll be able to rally ourselves and overcome that. But the reality is you are who you've trained yourself to be. There are no exceptions. God is not mocked. And that is why humility is needed. Because you have to be humble enough to receive that training if you're going to be fit to serve God in your family and train others. So let's talk about training others. The reality is this: telling is not enough. Telling is not enough. The reality is that we have all been shaped not by what our parents told us, but how they trained us. And the way that they trained us was their actions in the family. Right? The thing is that if your parents told you, hey, it's not wise to waste your money, but they were always spending like crazy, the reality is that you've been trained to waste your money. It doesn't matter what they told you, it matters how they trained you. And so when it comes to being effective in training the next generation and serving God in the family, we have to understand this principle. Telling is not enough, and training takes time and effort. You see, one of the things that I was completely mistaken about when I became a parent was that if I told my kids something, that they would do it. How many of you guys were foolish like that? Oh, we were sweet summer children, weren't we? We just were so naive to the way that it works. The reality is that when you tell your kids to do something, it accomplishes very little, right? Let's be honest, it does. What's effective is when you train your kids. And training your kids takes both time and effort. How do you train your kids? Well, sometimes it varies depending on what you're training them to do, but sometimes it means getting up and doing it with them. Right? Sometimes it means getting up and saying, hey, well, you're going to do this with me. And the thing is that you're going to include your kid and they're going to help, and you're going to spend twice as much time doing it because they're helping you, and you have to fix all their help, right? That's the way that it's going to work. Sometimes it means telling them to do something and going and checking on it. Sometimes there's a whole bunch of different ways, but a lot of times what it means is that when they do those things, you reward it, and when they don't do those things, you punish it. But that means that it takes a lot of attention from you, a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of effort. When it comes down to it, we have two different really explanations for why people behave the way they do. The first option is that they don't know any better. The reality is that while that's sometimes the case, it often is not. I remember my friend's dad growing up. I had a good friend, and his dad kind of became a good friend of mine. And he was a smoker, and his wife was always trying to get him to stop smoking. And so she created all kinds of rules about, not smoking in the house. He would try to smoke underneath the vents, the kitchen vent. He would turn it on and try to do that, and she would run him out of the house. And so she figured that if he was smoking outside, it would be hot, and he would have to come in. But he did air conditioning work for a living, so he didn't really mind the heat. But anyway, the point is that she kept telling him, hey, I want you to be here with the family. I don't want you to smoke. I remember coming home from college. And I had gotten sick at college, and I needed to get some money together, and he gave me a job, and I worked with him. He was that kind of guy, always doing stuff for other people. You could pull up to a gas station in the middle of Indio, California, and he would know everybody there. That's the kind of guy he was, a great guy. It was really sad for me when I moved back to Arizona to start my ministry here, to hear in a phone call that he was dying of cancer. To go and visit him as he took his last breaths in the world was incredibly difficult. The reality is that he knew. The problem with him was not that he knew, it's that he had trained himself very heavily, and he couldn't overcome that. So one option that we have is that people act the way they do because they don't know. But the second option is that they act the way they do because they have trained themselves to act that way. And it's going to require training and a lot of training to overcome the previous training to create a change in their lives. Here's the thing. If you want to be, and this is not just in the family, but if you want to be in service to God anywhere in your life, this is a principle that you're going to have to understand. That most of the time, seeing a change in somebody's life is going to mean committing yourself to helping them train. It's a commitment of time, it's a commitment of energy, it's a commitment of effort. It's a commitment that's going to have a lot of ups and downs. There are going to be moments of triumph, there's going to be moments of failure, there's going to be times when they seem to make huge strides in their life, there's going to be times when they seem to take 3 steps back. You have to be committed to that process. Man, I don't know how many times as a parent I found myself being short with my kids because I didn't understand this principle. I thought because I had told them I had done my job as a parent. And I didn't realize that my job as a parent was not to teach them as much as it was to train them. It was not to tell them what they needed to do, but to walk through doing what they needed to do together. We have to understand that when we seek to train anybody, that one of our biggest tasks that will end up in front of us is that we are going to have to overcome their natural desire, their natural tendency for resentment. How many of you guys ever had a coach or a boss that you didn't like? Raise your hand. Anybody? You ever had a coach or a boss that you didn't like? Yeah? The thing is that, did you ask yourself, what is it that I don't like about them? Right? Have you ever done that? Have you ever said to yourself, what is it about this person that I don't like? And have you ever asked yourself, the question isn't whether I like them or not, but am I getting results? Right? Have you ever said to yourself, the reason that I might not like them is because their intensity in training me is building up resentment in me. That their desire to see results in my life is really what I'm upset about. You guys understand what I'm saying? What I'm saying is this: a lot of times we have a resentful attitude toward those people that are trying the hardest to improve our lives. We have a tendency to find resentment in our hearts for those who see our potential more than we do, who are more demanding of us and our behavior than we are of our own behavior. If you've ever had a trainer who says to you, give me more, give me more, give me more. I remember as a junior high student being in football, and, we had this coach, and this coach was just always like, you couldn't please him. He always wanted more. You had to run more lines. You had to run more drills. You had to run more. And I remember just thinking, man, what is wrong with this guy? I just can't stand this guy. It's interesting that we would have that response to somebody who's bringing out the best in us. And what's happening in that moment is that we are resenting the person that's driving us to kill their flesh. The reality is that the flesh never dies easily. And whether you're doing the killing or somebody else is helping you, when you kill the flesh, there is going to be an emotional reaction that you will have, and it will be resentment, right? You will resent the fact that you have to do this. You might resent God for asking you to do this, but you also might resent the person who is helping you to get rid of those things in your life. Why? Because you're comfortable with them. You like them. They become like close friends with you. And you just don't understand why they can't be left alone. You just don't understand why it has to be this way. You just don't understand why you should be doing more. I can look back at my life and see very clearly that there were people who were trying to help me to overcome the flesh. They were people who were trying to train me in righteousness. And my natural response was toward resentment. I wish I could go back and tell them all, thank you. Tell them all, I apologize. But some of them I can't do that. But you know what I can do? I can understand that if I'm going to go and I'm going to try to train other people, that I can expect that reaction, I can understand that reaction, and I can have grace for that reaction. I can be the person who is patient to that reaction, who says, you know what? I understand. I was the same way myself. But somebody loved me enough to put up with me and my bad behavior in order to kill this thing in me that needed to be killed. You see, when you decide to serve in the family, what you have to understand is that if it's not motivated by real love for them, it will falter. Because often you will not be thanked. Often you will be despised. Often you will not receive accolades or adulation. Often what you will receive is talk back. Often what you will receive is disobedience. Often what you will receive is sneaking around. But the question is, have you been trained in love enough to love them through their sin? Can you have patience and gentleness? You know, it's interesting that there are a ton of verses in the Bible about disciplining children. There's a ton. And a lot of them talk about the rod, right? Giving a good smackdown. And, you know, there are times as a parent I appreciate those verses. But I also have to bear in mind this verse. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 4. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant. Even in the midst of sometimes having to use discipline, it all has to be motivated out of love. Let's finally talk about celebrating victory. In Proverbs chapter 23, verse 13 and 14, it says, do not withhold, this is one of those verses actually, do not withhold discipline from a child. If you strike him with a rod, if you strike him with a rod, he will not die. I guess it depends on how big the rod is and how hard you strike him. But I think they're telling us that it's more of a discipline thing. It's not deadly. It's not deadly. Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you strike him with a rod, he will not die. If you strike him with the rod, you will save his soul from Sheol. It's talking about how, as a parent, that there are times you have to discipline your kid, and it's not fun, it's not easy. But the reality is that you are saving them from a terrible, terrible fate. You are saving them from a terrible fate, both in this life and in the life to come. I think a lot of times as parents, the thing that we hope for is for our kids to come back and say thank you. And I tell you, it's a great thing when that happens. When our kids, it's funny, both of them, when they went to boot camp, when they came back from boot camp, they said, thank you. And we're like, what do you mean? And they're like, we just realized that so many kids were never taught anything. And the thing is that it wasn't like they weren't taught this or that, like technical things, like how to drive or that kind of thing. It's that they weren't trained, they weren't disciplined. You see, the reality is that what we're hoping for, where all of this is leading, it's leading towards joy. That's why all this is happening. Because the disciplining of our kids, the training of our kids is not just so that we can be a taskmaster or a drill sergeant over them. It's so that their joy might be complete. It's so that they might experience all the joy that God has for them, both in this life and in the life to come. You see, the thing that we have to get out of our minds is that by training our children, we're taking away from their joy. That is actually the opposite of the truth. By training our children, we're increasing their joy. And joy ought to be the goal. Sometimes we can be curmudgeons. We can, be that old guy who says, "Get off my lawn." But if that's happening in our lives, that has to be killed. It needs to be trained out of us. We have as our motivation love for our children and the increasing of their joy. The reality is that God desires nothing more for us than to live in harmony and in unity with Him and to experience the joy of our salvation every day of our lives. That's what God desires for us. But the reality is that there are so many things that can take away from that. There are so many pitfalls that can be in front of us. God wants us to avoid all of those things. He wants us to experience joy. He wants us to experience fruitfulness. Can we, together in our families, celebrate the joy of our training in righteousness? Can we celebrate the joy of our training in godliness? Can we experience a life with God together with our families where all of us are blessed and all of us experience that unity and joy in Him? That should be our goal. Well, to do that, we need to believe and belong and become. We talk about that a lot here. So what from today's message should we believe, belong, and become? Well, first of all, we should believe that God is training you for your joy. It's not always fun to be trained, but God has. When you were training with a coach, when you were in junior high football or junior high track, you were training with your coach. Your coach was training you so that you would win the prize. God is training you to win the prize of everlasting joy with Him. We need to belong to Him through a covenant of unity. Everything that is not unified with Christ should be trained out of us. Everything that does not conform to the image of Christ should be completely gone in our lives, and we should commit ourselves to that training. And finally, we should become like Him, fully and completely as He trains us in joy.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to His church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at www.fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.